The Nevada desert burned under a white sky, the heat rolling off the ground in waves that bent the horizon. It was 2:30 p.m. at Fort Ravenwood, a training base carved out of sand and silence, built to harden recruits under the same discipline as Fort Benning. The air shimmered above the firing range where rows of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, boots planted in gravel, backs straight, sweat trickling under their collars. The scent of oil and gunmetal hung in the air, sharp and familiar. Staff Sergeant Cole Harris paced the line, clipboard in hand, his voice steady but worn from years of command. He called names with the rhythm of habit, issuing sidearms one by one. Beretta M9, Glock 17, the standard tools of qualification day. Each recruit stepped forward, took the weapon, and moved to the next mark. The sound of metal latches and distant targets filled the stillness. When Harris reached the end of the roster, he called for Private Emily Carter, a tall, lean woman of 23. She stepped from formation, the brim of her patrol cap shadowing her calm face. Her tone was even steady as she requested a rifle instead of a sidearm. The line went quiet for a heartbeat before the laughter began, low at first, then louder as recruits traded glances. The desert carried their voices farther than they meant. Harris stopped pacing and looked her over, not angry, just surprised. He'd seen overconfident rookies before, but her stance didn't match arrogance. It was stillness, focus, something else. The laughter faded as he studied her. Around them, the wind pressed the heat tighter against their skin. For a moment, even the desert seemed to wait, holding its breath as Harris considered her request. Staff Sergeant Harris studied Emily for a long second, the sun glinting off the mirrored lenses of his glasses. His voice came calm but edged with dry humor as he reminded her that this was not a hunting trip and that recruits were expected to start small. Emily didn't shift her stance. Her tone stayed level as she asked again to qualify with the M4A1 carbine. Around them, the line of recruits snickered, a few whispering under their breath. The sound carried easily through the dry air. Harris's smirk faded as he weighed the moment, then finally exhaled and nodded once. 5 rounds. 100 meters. If she could hit the target, she would earn her choice. If not, she would run laps until the sun dropped behind the mountains. The murmurs grew louder as Emily stepped forward to receive the rifle. She inspected it like it was an old friend. Her thumb brushed the magazine release. She checked the chamber, ensured the selector switch was on safe, and adjusted her stance until her body lined perfectly behind the barrel. The ACOG optic caught the sunlight as she brought the rifle to her shoulder. The range grew quiet. Even the desert wind seemed to hesitate. She took a breath, deep and steady, and switched from safe to semi. The first shot cracked sharp through the air. The recoil pushed against her shoulder, controlled and clean. Dust lifted from the target's center. 4 more shots had followed, each one smooth, precise, timed with her breathing. When she lowered the rifle, the echo lingered across the range. Harris raised his binoculars. The 5 holes formed a tight cluster. Dead center. No chatter followed. The recruits stared. Harris lowered the binoculars slowly, disbelief written across his face. The desert fell into stillness. Something had just shifted at Fort Ravenwood. By sunrise the next morning, the story had already made its way through every corner of Fort Ravenwood, in the barracks. Recruits whispered about the farm girl from Montana who had embarrassed half the firing line with an M4A1. Some called it luck. Others called it impossible. By breakfast, it reached the mess hall, where laughter mixed with curiosity as soldiers tried to decide whether to be impressed or offended. By the 3rd day, it had grown into something else. Private Emily Carter had become the quiet subject of every conversation. That afternoon, Sergeant Miguel Alvarez from the Advanced Marksmanship Unit showed up at the range, clipboard tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable. Years of combat and instruction had trained him to spot small things others missed. As Emily moved through her drills, he noticed the precision in every motion, the way her grip settled perfectly without adjustment, the way her breathing slowed naturally before each shot. The smooth transition from standing to kneeling, even the way she scanned terrain, using natural cover instead of standing in the open. Those weren't habits picked up in boot camp. That was field instinct. Alvarez watched longer than planned, his eyes narrowing slightly. When she finished the course, he called her over, his voice calm and curious. He asked if she had ever trained formally. Emily shook her head. Her grandfather had taught her back home. Just basic handling. Alvarez studied her, realizing that what he had just seen wasn't hobby skill. It was something built over years, embedded in her muscle memory. After she left, he joined Staff Sergeant Harris near the observation tent. His tone was low, almost to himself. "She moves like someone who's been deployed." Harris didn't answer, but both men stood quietly. Knowing something about this recruit didn't add up. The clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m. when Captain Daniel Hale stepped into the administrative briefing room at Fort Ravenwood. The blinds were half drawn, the desert light cutting across the polished table. He was the kind of officer whose uniform always looked pressed even after a 12-hour day. A man who measured order in heartbeats and paperwork. On the table before him lay a file stamped with Emily Carter's name, her training reports, marksmanship records, and performance notes were stacked in neat precision. He read them twice, his jaw tightening slightly with each page. The numbers didn't make sense. No recruit had ever scored that consistently. Not on day one, not on any day. Across the table, Staff Sergeant Harris and Sergeant Alvarez waited in silence. Harris finally spoke first, saying she wasn't showy, didn't brag, but that she shot cleaner than anyone he'd seen outside a deployment zone. Alvarez added quietly that her stance and breathing looked like combat muscle memory. Hale's gaze shifted between them, skeptical but curious. He pressed the intercom and called for Private Carter to report. Minutes later, Emily entered, boots sharp against the floor, her posture textbook perfect. She stood at attention, voice steady as she greeted the captain. He questioned her background, her family, and who had trained her. She answered simply. Her grandfather had taught her on their farm in Montana. Nothing more. Hale leaned back, studying her expression for arrogance or hesitation, but found none, just composure. He dismissed her with a clipped nod, his tone unreadable. After she left, the room felt heavier. Alvarez spoke first, half under his breath. "You ever hear of those old recon units from Vietnam? The ones with the bird insignia?" Hale's eyes flicked up from the file, his voice low. Black Talons. The name settled into the air like dust that refused to fall. The desert at Fort Ravenwood was already scorching by mid-morning when the sound of engines rolled across the open range. A convoy of matte black vehicles appeared through the heat shimmer, dust trailing behind them like smoke. Soldiers lined the road in formation, uniforms pressed, boots polished to mirror shine. The base had not seen a visit like this in years. General Margaret Stone's arrival brought a stillness that even the wind respected. She was known throughout the Army for her precision, her cold logic, and a reputation for turning units into legends or tearing them apart. When she stepped out of the lead vehicle, every spine on the range straightened. Captain Daniel Hale met her near the command post, clipboard tucked tight under his arm. He briefed her with professional precision, explaining that one recruit in particular had drawn attention for her marksmanship. Private Emily Carter. Stone listened without interrupting, eyes scanning the range as he spoke. Her tone was calm, clipped, when she requested to see the recruit in action. Within minutes, the range was prepared. Targets stood lined at 100, 200, and 300 meters. The recruits gathered quietly at the sidelines, their whispers carried away by the hot wind. Emily stepped to the line, receiving an M4A1 carbine fitted with an ACOG 4 optic. Her movements were methodical. Chamber check, selector on safe, stock adjusted, stance squared. She exhaled once and lowered into firing position. The first shot cracked through the air, echoing across the valley. The next 4 followed, each one sharp and deliberate. 5 perfect hits at 100 meters. At 200, she adjusted for drift. The same clean rhythm, the same control. At 300, she paused, reading the wind through heat waves, then fired again. The final impact struck dead center. Silence settled over the range. Stone raised her binoculars, studied the pattern, and lowered them slowly. She approached Emily, asking for her name and the name of her grandfather. When Emily answered, Stone's gaze drifted to the faint edge of ink beneath the sleeve of her uniform. A black-winged bird. Talons extended. The general's eyes changed, recognition flickering just once before she straightened. She dismissed the recruit with formality, her voice cool but distant. As she turned away, her tone dropped low, almost to herself. Black Talons. The words lingered in the desert air, quiet and heavy, as the echo of a buried memory. By late afternoon, the desert had cooled to a soft gold, the heat broken by the slow drop of the sun behind the mountains. The range was quiet now, empty, except for Private Emily Carter sitting at the bench, cleaning her M4A1 with the slow, steady care of habit. The metal gleamed faintly in the fading light. Gravel crunched behind her as General Margaret Stone approached. Alone this time. No aides, no officers, no ceremony, only the sound of wind and boots. Stone stopped a few feet away, her voice low but edged with something personal. She asked about the mark under Emily's sleeve. Emily hesitated before answering. "It was a tattoo," she said. One she shared with her grandfather. A bird with wings spread and talons extended. Stone's face didn't move, but her eyes did. She turned toward the distant range and ordered everyone within earshot to clear the area. Within minutes, the base fell into silence. When she turned back, her voice carried something different now, quieter, almost wary. "Black Talons," she whispered, the name tasting like memory. Emily looked confused. The general said nothing more, only gestured for her to follow. They walked through the dusk, toward the administrative building, the air thick with unspoken questions. Inside, Stone led her down a corridor lined with locked doors until they stopped at one marked restricted access. The keypad clicked, and the door opened to a small room of metal filing cabinets and the faint smell of dust and paper. Stone moved to a safe, entered a code, and withdrew a folder yellowed with age. Across the front, stamped faint but clear, Mac v. SOG Recon. She laid it on the table and opened it. Inside was a black and white photo of a young man in jungle fatigues, an M21 sniper rifle balanced across his knees. His eyes were sharp, calm, familiar. Emily felt her breath catch. The name written beneath the photo read, Samuel Carter. Stone's voice softened as she spoke. "Eagle Eye," she said. "One of the finest marksmen we ever had. He served in a long-range reconnaissance unit in Vietnam called the Black Talons. They operated beyond maps, beyond orders. Their missions erased from official record. Most of them vanished into history." She paused, studying Emily's face. "Your skill isn't luck, Private. It's inheritance." The weight of her words hung in the room, heavy and quiet as the past that had just stepped back into the light. The sound of the door opening broke the silence in the secure room. A tall, spare man stepped in, his uniform crisp despite the years on his shoulders. Colonel Thomas Reed moved with the calm certainty of someone who had carried both command and memory longer than most soldiers had been alive. His gray eyes fell on the open file, the photograph of Samuel Carter. For a long moment, he said nothing in a kanin. Then his expression softened. He remembered him, the quiet one with the steady hands. He saved my life once. His voice was low, filled with the kind of weight that didn't need rank to be respected. He told them how, in the thick jungles of Vietnam, their team had been ambushed during a long-range recon mission. Samuel had carried a wounded teammate for miles, rationing water, leaving false trails, never slowing until he reached extraction. Reed paused, pulling a folded paper from a file he carried. It was a copy of a Medal of Honor citation. The ink faded with time. The award was never issued, he explained, because the mission itself was classified, but the record remained. Emily stood still, her gaze on the photo, the man she remembered teaching her to shoot soda cans. Behind, a barn, had once navigated a war with nothing but grit and instinct. General Stone added quietly that Samuel Carter's control and focus were unmatched, the kind of discipline that couldn't be taught, only lived. Reed nodded and reached into his pocket, sliding a small card across the table. Advanced Sniper Program, Special Operations Command, Colorado. He told her the Black Talons had never been about glory. They stood for purpose, precision, and integrity. Emily held the card, her heartbeat slow and steady. Her grandfather's lessons were never about aim. They were about legacy. And now she understood she had just been asked to continue it. The air in Colorado bit like steel when Emily Carter stepped off the transport. The base sat high in the mountains wrapped in snow and silence. It wasn't a regular army post. There were no banners, no ceremony, only the sound of wind cutting between peaks and the faint echo of gunfire somewhere beyond the ridge. The sign at the gate said nothing. This was the Advanced Sniper Program under Special Operations Command, a place where mistakes froze in the snow before they ever reached the world below. Training started before dawn at 4:30 a.m. Recruits were dragged from their bunks into the cold, their breath turning white as they marched through the dark, carrying 60-pound packs. The days blurred into endurance. They learned to shoot, move, and survive in conditions that punished hesitation. Emily learned to work with rifles far beyond what she had ever known. The M2010 Enhanced Sniper Rifle in .300 Winchester Magnum, the MK13 Mod 7 in .300 Norma Magnum, weapons built for distance, silence, and precision. Each morning began with zeroing drills, aligning sights and correcting for elevation and wind. Instructors demanded perfection. If a single shot missed its mark, they started again. The cold bore test was the hardest. One shot from a rifle that hadn't been fired since yesterday. No warm-up, no adjustment. The bullet had to land true, or she would repeat the exercise until it did. Her fingers cracked in the cold. Her knuckles bled, but her shots never drifted far. Master Sergeant Luis Torres watched from behind the line, quiet and expressionless. He said little, but his notes showed more than approval. She adapted faster than anyone else. In the afternoons, the T-6 Texan II trainers took the recruits aloft for aerial reconnaissance drills. From the cockpit, Emily learned to read the land below, to mark targets in motion, to translate terrain into numbers and angles. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. Her hands grew rough, her voice steadier, her patience absolute. She no longer thought about proving herself. She simply performed. Every shot carried the same rhythm her grandfather once taught her. Steady breath, steady hand. By the time spring broke the snow, the farm girl from Montana was gone. In her place stood a soldier shaped by cold, silence, and purpose. The mountains were quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Early spring had stripped the snow from most of the ridges, leaving streaks of white clinging to the rock. The air was sharp, thin enough to taste metal in every breath. Wind cut across the range in steady gusts, carrying flecks of ice that bit the skin. Private Emily Carter lay prone on the ridge, her MK13 Mod 7 rifle settled on its bipod. 18 months of training had led to this moment. One shot, 1,000 yards. No second chance. Her spotter crouched beside her, scanning the valley through his scope. 2 mills left drift, he said quietly, the wind shifting against the rock face. Emily adjusted her optic, dialing windage until the reticle rested exactly where it should. She recalculated the bullet drop for the temperature and altitude, adjusted her position, and pressed the stock firmly into her shoulder. Her heartbeat slowed. She inhaled, exhaled halfway, then stopped. For that fraction of silence, nothing existed beyond the sight picture. The crosshair hovered just below the steel silhouette on the far ridge. Her finger tightened against the trigger, the pad finding its familiar breakpoint. The rifle cracked, a clean, suppressed sound that seemed to hang in the air. The echo rolled through the valley, followed by a long second of absolute stillness. Then, far downrange, the target rocked once, then toppled backward with a hard metallic clang that carried through the wind. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise. Behind her, instructors lowered their binoculars one by one. No one spoke. Master Sergeant Luis Torres stepped forward, his breath a faint cloud in the cold air. He studied the fallen target, then looked at her and nodded once. "No one has ever done that before," he said quietly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small insignia pin, a black-winged bird, talons spread. He fastened it to her uniform, his tone steady. "Welcome to the lineage." Emily looked out over the valley, the horizon blurring in the morning light. She let herself breathe again. Not pride, not triumph, just peace. The same calm her grandfather once carried when the world demanded precision. The legacy was whole. The fields in Montana were gold again. The wheat swayed under the late afternoon sun, the air soft and slow, carrying the scent of soil and faint oil from the barn that still stood after all these years. Emily Carter walked the narrow dirt path that cut through the fields, the same path her grandfather once took every morning. Her boots brushed against the tall grass, and the wind hummed like memory. The old farmhouse came into view, its porch creaking gently in the breeze. Paint had faded, but the place still felt alive, still carried the echo of laughter and the quiet rhythm of discipline that had shaped her. Behind it, beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree, was the small grave. The marker was simple, just his name and the words U.S. Army, Samuel Carter. No medals, no rank, only service. Emily knelt beside it, the leather of her gloves whispering against the grass. In her hand, she held the Black Talon insignia pin, the same symbol her grandfather once bore, the same emblem now carried by her. She pressed it gently into the earth beside his name. The soil gave way easily, the metal catching a glint of sunlight before settling into shadow. She stayed there for a while, listening to the quiet. The wind moved through the fields, bending the wheat in slow waves. In it, she could almost hear his voice again. See the wind, not the target. His lessons were never about shooting. They were about patience, about seeing beyond the noise. When she rose, she stood at attention, her posture straight, her breath even. She gave a silent salute, the kind meant for one soldier to another. Then she turned toward the horizon. The light stretched far across the fields, endless and gold. She walked toward it, calm and steady. True strength, she thought, doesn't speak. It endures. It is carried forward in silence, in purpose, and in respect.